Hello world, you are listening to Strategikon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. I'm your host John Bruni, and with me in the studio today is co-host and SAGE International Associate David Olney from the University of Adelaide and Strategikon moderator Ashley Felderhoff. Ashley, what do we see in the news today?
Well, from the newswires today, Islamic State has attacked Kurdish outposts across Iraq. Reports from Baghdad say that Islamic State militants struck at Kurdish forces southwest of the Iraqi city of Kirkuk on Friday, while bombs in Kirkuk, Baghdad, Samarra and Ramadi killed at least 27 people. In Ukraine, peace talks have been aborted. Civilians were killed on both sides in heavy fighting in eastern Ukraine on Friday, while an attempt to reopen peace talks in neighbouring Belarus was aborted before it even began. From Beirut, the leader of Lebanon's Hezbollah said on Friday his group did not want war with Israel, but was ready for one, and reserved the right to respond to Israeli attacks anytime, anywhere. Also from Beirut, reports that fighting between the Syrian arm of al-Qaeda and Western-backed rebels in northern Syria spread from Aleppo province into neighbouring Idlib on Friday. The rebel group and an organisation monitoring the civil war reported this just recently. And Republican Mitt Romney has opted out of a 2016 run for presidency. He bowed out of the US presidential race on Friday after considering a third run, telling supporters it was time for the next generation of party leaders to seek the White House. Also, in a surprise move, the Russian central bank has cut interest rates. Cut its main interest rate on Friday as fears of a recession mount in the country, following the fall in global oil prices and Western sanctions over the Ukraine crisis. And lastly, from Japan, this is from Tokyo, Reuters reporting that the two countries, Japan and Jordan, are struggling to find out what's happened to two of their nationals being held by Islamic State after a deadline passed for the release of a would-be suicide bomber being held on death row in Amman. So with that, perhaps just over to the team.
I'm interested to know how Japan and Jordan would try to work out between themselves what has happened to their individual citizens. Jordan is in the neighbourhood and should have some sort of insight. Japan is new to kind of difficult security situations in the modern world. This is a case of an inside player with a huge amount of understanding having to deal with a very economically powerful state who diplomatically is insignificant in the region.
Yeah, my thought is, are they going to find out just the way everyone else has from Facebook?
I think that's exactly what's going to happen. I mean, these groups are very savvy with regard to social media, and obviously the greatest impact in the modern world is to exploit social media the best way you can. And what is the best way under these circumstances? Obviously a public beheading. So I think that probably we'll just have to wait another mandatory few days to find out what happened.
I wonder if there's a big difference too between potentially beheading, someone from the region versus a Japanese citizen. Which way around IS would choose to create a public spectacle? Would they aim to upset the region? Because that has a more immediate impact, shows they're very serious on their own turf.
Well, I wonder, actually, that's a good point, David, because how will that play out domestically with the countries in the region, I guess is what you're saying, isn't it? So far it's been seen as a war just on the West, but you're right, that may have different implications.
Oh, certainly. I mean, this is not just a war against the West. It's actually a war for the hearts and minds of the Middle East, in a sense. And I don't know. I mean, I think that the region itself is pretty upset with the state of play at the moment. The Saudis are fighting their shadow war against the Iranians. The Iranians are fighting their shadow war against the Saudis. The Islamic State gets its funding from whatever sources it can, and also has its own base of financial support, which it worked hard to achieve. So it's an independent entity. It has, the Islamic State has done unspeakable acts, against people in the region, be they Kurds, be they any kind of ethnic and sectarian group. So really, in a sense, would the region be any more upset at the Islamic State were they to go after Jordanians? I'm not particularly convinced.
I guess it depends whether they're going to consider Jordanians to be apostates. When they aim at Yazidis, they've very clearly made the apostate argument that you're not being a proper version of us. So Jordan, a citizen from Jordan would be a great way to continue that and demonstrate there is only one way to be an appropriate IS Muslim. But that's a big step.
Well, you see that in the Syrian battlefields anyway. I mean, IS forces have hit at Sunni Arab forces that are fighting against Bashar al-Assad in order to get maximum political coverage and in order to make themselves appear, the biggest and fiercest group in the Syrian battle space. So in actual fact, they're already killing Sunni Arabs from other groups, including groups like al-Nusra.
But it's a perception difference. That's in Syria, and Syria is unsecured space. What you do in unsecured space is secure a part of it for you. So in a sense, that's conventional combat, or their variant of conventional combat, as opposed to direct political statement through social media. So there's at least two strategies going on there, and a potentially Japanese citizen has to be a third media strategy. What's the gain there? Asking for a ridiculously high ransom, which the Japanese have got no reason to pay. Traditionally, if we look sort of within the Japanese diplomatic corps, there's been a running joke since about 2002 of what they call suicide tourism. And that is that Japanese citizens end up in the most dangerous of places, not realising the rest of the world isn't like Japan.
Can I just ask, excuse me, David, what is the Japanese policy on paying ransoms for their citizens? Is it like the Europeans, which tends to be more compliant than the US?
They claim they don't want to do it because of their own internal problems, like the sarin gas attack in the 90s, that they don't want to go down the path. But quietly, as the expectation is, they would be more like the Europeans and more likely to come to an accommodation because all this is so new and frightening for them.
All right. Well, look, can we just move on to another topic that did come up in the news? That was the Russian central bank's surprise interest rate cut. Obviously, the world has been faced with the almost halving of the oil price in the last 12 months, also Western sanctions on Russia. Are we starting to see evidence that that those sanctions are really starting to bite? And what effect, if any, will it have on a regime which is making a name for itself as being very nationalist, regardless of the economic consequences?
I think what we are seeing right now is the fact that the collapse in the price of oil has had a deleterious effect on all states, primarily Russia, because obviously this is the story that we're concerned with, but any state that has as its primary source of income stream oil and gas. The collapse is going to have a really bad effect on being able to collect the revenues necessary to fund the state. In the Russian sense, though, it's going to be interesting to see how far Putin can continue to play the military strongman card when it is the military who needs unfettered access to oil and gas and all these kind of resources.
And also the money that they generate.
And the money that they generate. And if the money's not coming in, you can't pay for weapons modernization, you can't pay for training. And I think at current clip, Putin had managed to reform about a third of the Russian military, the Russian Federation's military, which is at a really good end at the point of training, at the point of having logistical supplies that make sense in the Russian context, and also in terms of high-tech equipment, new high-tech equipment coming on board. But that leaves two-thirds of the Russian military not being in that position. So again, how far can Putin play his card with this kind of economic weight on his shoulders when we look at the Ukraine issue, for instance, and further afield as well, because he's also flying aircraft all over the west coast of the United States, trying to pump the Russian military to be something that it actually isn't, but still it gives the public perception that they're very strong.
The macho image thing.
Yeah.
But, is that going to be a factor? And David, interested to know what you think as well, or is it just the fact that, this bellicose policy tends to get Russian public opinion on his side, if the opinion polls are any indication?
I think two critical context issues to bring to the table. First one is that the Poles are going to spend $33 billion on modernisation of their defence forces in the next couple of years. And this year they're calling up about 12,000 reservists for exercises. They're already planning for 2016 that it could be as high as 38,000 reservists doing exercises. So the instability in the neighbourhood could actually mean that what Putin started, he has to continue. Because if the Poles are going to continue to spend money at this level and are going to ensure that their reservists are absolutely ready to roll into Ukraine if necessary, that means he can't back down. The other bit of context I'd like to bring to this is the fact that last year the Saudi Arabians opened a major new oil processing plant. That can make money at oil at a price of $18 a barrel. So the oil price can crash a lot further, and Russia's neighbours are starting to respond to Putin's bellicose behaviour. So the grip is getting worse, the vice is getting more uncomfortable for him by the month.
Well, here's the interesting point, and that is, Putin is in a very untenable situation at the moment. But is it because
I was going to say the problem is he doesn't think he is, but anyway.
Well, he's putting on a great degree of bluster at this point in time, and that's fine for him. But the real key issue here is that is Saudi Arabia really the enemy of Moscow, or is Saudi Arabia acting as a stalking horse for the United States? You know, when we talk about this whole resumption of Cold War hostilities, I mean, who are the real actors, that are fronting up to do damage to Moscow at this point in time? And once the damage is done, are we actually going to see Russia in a different light? I mean, okay, so we get rid of Putin. So say the economic pain in Russia becomes so unbearable and there's a coup d'etat and Putin gets ousted. Will we in the West actually look at Russia, or will Russia look at the West in a different, more conciliatory light? That's really the question here. Or is it going to go back to business as usual? Maybe a little bit less of a sting out there in the international community in terms of perceptions, but still we really don't trust the Russians because we still all suffer from this post-Cold War, as in 1947 to 91 Cold War funk.
There's no evidence that if Putin was gone, that Russia would want to look more toward the West. The oligarchs like spending money there, but they don't want to be like it. The proportion of the educated population who wanted to be more Western, the majority have long since left. So a Russia without Putin is the same Russia. It's dependent on resources. It can't manufacture anything but weapons. It's got demographic problems. It's got a somewhat reconstructed but not fully reconstructed military. It's trying to make deals in Central Asia to grow an economic union. It got all excited about that last November and December. That's looking less credible all the time. It's building relationships with China that are reminiscent with the relationships between China and the Soviet Union in the 1950s, where at the time the Soviet Union didn't need China, China needed the Soviet Union. Now it's a reversal.
Okay. Well, look, I think it's probably time that we moved on to our main topic, following on closely from the Swiss decision to unpeg their currency, the franc, from the euro on January 15th. The victory of the anti-austerity party Syriza in the Greek national elections on January 25th sent waves of uncertainty throughout the European and global markets. Fearing a cataclysmic default, a Greek exit, or Grexit as it's been termed, from the Eurozone, and even the prospect of a Greek-Russian financial pact, none of which have happened yet, how concerned should we be about political developments in Greece, and how might they play out for the European Union, guys?
It's interesting. This first week since the arrival of the Syriza government, if you will, in Athens, there's been a lot of talk, but not a lot of action. There was talk about all manner of things happening. The Grexit, now the Russians are sort of moving in and perhaps snafuing a broken-back European state for their own strategic ends, and that may be true, I don't know. But so far it seems to me that anything that's happening in Athens, at least if first week is any indication of this government, that Tsipras and his colleagues will be trying to stir the pot for the European Union insofar as they can get a better deal from the European Union. I don't know whether or not they genuinely want to leave the Eurozone. I could be wrong, but I suspect strongly that behind the closed doors there are going to be a number of deals and things done to keep the Greeks in check.
An interesting thing this week is one of the first things the new Prime Minister did was to sack the people in charge of the privatisation authority and stop any further moves to privatise the two main ports in Greece. So at least for public consumption at home, he took immediate action that said, I'm going to follow through on promises to the level at which I can as fast as I can. But in a sense, by doing those two things in the first few days, he's pretty much now done the things he can do. From here on in, if he wants to put more public employees back to work, if he wants pension plans to have more money in them, he needs money from somewhere. So this idea of some sort of deal with Russia, which people are speculating on because it's just such an exciting idea. The idea that Russia gets somewhere to go and spend its money, and Russians who aren't allowed to travel to Europe anymore get somewhere warm and nice to go sailing, and the Greeks get access to cash, and probably more significantly, as a maritime power, if they can have access to cheap oil to run their merchant marine fleet, and this is their biggest earner other than tourism.
It's interesting, The Economist has cast it very much as almost in movie themes. Their leader sort of paraphrases a certain Hollywood star, "Go ahead, Angela," or "Angela, make my day," characterising this as a Mexican standoff, if you like, between German Chancellor Angela Merkel and Mr. Tsipras. They postulate that there are three outcomes, once again borrowing from a movie theme, not quite the good, the bad, the ugly, but what they're calling the good, the disastrous, and a compromise to kick the can down the road. And they do make the point that usually that's the the European Union's modus operandi, but they actually suggest that if everyone was grown up and sensible, that the Germans would recognise that the Greek debt has got unmanageable at something like $173 billion. They don't actually have a realistic prospect of paying that off. If the terms could be renegotiated, particularly in terms of the timing of the maturity of the debt, they could give that concession. Also, that in fact their austerity has ushered in deflation, which we all know is long-term not going to be good for either the European or the world economies. And if Mr. Tsipras would moderate some of his more extreme views, you might have a solution, but they don't hold out much hope for that.
No, they don't. And I think that the interesting thing from a European Union perspective is that this whole situation has come on the back of the Swiss unpegging its currency, the franc, from the euro, and that move in itself sent shockwaves throughout the world of high finance. And of course, the Swiss had very good reasons for doing this, very good national reasons for doing this. One of the primary drivers for the Swiss decision was that whatever happens to the euro, whether good or bad, will have a really bad effect on Switzerland. The cost of Swiss goods going out of Switzerland is so high at the moment, no one's buying it. So, of course, I think that there was a sense by Swiss authorities that they needed to revert back to some form of national sovereignty. And we have to also remember that the Swiss franc was only pegged to the euro in 2011. So, for them to actually walk away from the euro, it's not like they're walking away from a decade-long kind of arrangement. They're walking away after having been a sovereign economic entity, and now they want to reinstitute that sovereignty. And I think that they may very well have some good reasons for doing that. So, of course, that following on from an anti-austerity party like Syriza in Greece coming on board, I think, gives the perception that the Eurozone is undergoing some form of crisis of confidence more than anything else.
If we talk about Switzerland here for a second more, I think an important thing is they tied the franc to the euro as an interesting experiment. And part of their reasons for getting out of this are economic, but part of it's also cultural. Switzerland is independent. It does its thing. It doesn't get dragged along by other people. It sustains its Swiss identity. And I think this is an interesting link between what the Swiss did. They took a decision that had some economic purpose, but also was very much about their identity. In a sense, we're seeing the same thing in Greece now. The new Prime Minister wants to talk to individual heads of state and finance ministers in the EU. He doesn't want to deal with nameless, faceless institutions, because the nameless, faceless institutions have been treating the Greek people like numbers. They've not been acknowledging the consequences of treating people this way. Okay,
look, I should probably butt in here. We're running out of time, but just one correction. I mentioned $175 billion. It's actually 175% of GDP is Greece's debt, which is obviously a colossal figure.
Yeah, look, it is a colossal figure, and quite frankly, if we go back to the idea of Russia and Greece making some form of financial, maybe social, political relationship forged as a consequence of both countries having junk status currencies, I think in a sense it's almost like these two countries are joined not only by their religious affiliations, being Orthodox, but also by their joint inability to manage finance in the way that the West Europeans would like them to. So it's going to be an interesting period of time ahead.
Okay, well, gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, that's a wrap for this week. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and we look forward to your company again next week. Our thanks to producer Alicia Morrow, David Olney, and Ashley Felderhoff. For now, goodbye from the Strategikon team.